The evening air in Virginia was thick with the scent of tobacco and pine, the slow rhythm of summer pressing upon the hills. In the fading light, I remember standing at the edge of the fields, a boy quiet among the rows, my ears filled with the song of crickets and the hum of life that never ceased. I was not born into noise or power, but into silence. Silence broken only by the wind through the trees, the clatter of tools, the murmurs of those who worked the land. That silence suited me, for I was a boy more inclined to listening than to speaking, more drawn to books than to company. My earliest companions were not neighbors or playmates, but pages filled with words, stories of lands far beyond Virginia, ideas that stretched farther than the horizon I could see. My father was a man of stature, respected in Albemarle County, strong and commanding. He was a surveyor, a planter, a man who shaped land and commanded men. From him I inherited strength of body, but not his taste for dominance. I preferred the gentler company of my mother, her refinement, her music, her quiet influence. In her, I found the grace that would temper the restlessness I carried. She filled our home with the sound of harpsichord and voice, and it was there that I first felt how music could soothe and stir the spirit, how art could speak truths unspoken. When my father died suddenly, I was but 14, left with a grief too large to name and responsibilities that weighed more heavily than my years could bear. He left me land, property, the beginnings of wealth, but also the burden of expectation. I knew then that my life would not be ordinary. Even in my youth, I felt the shadow of destiny pressing at my shoulder, though I did not yet know its shape. School became my sanctuary. I devoured Latin and Greek, wrestled with mathematics, and lost myself in philosophy. I studied the ancients, Cicero, Aristotle, Plato, their words like sparks in my mind, igniting questions about government, justice, and the nature of liberty. I was a boy in Virginia, but in my thoughts I walked with men who had shaped empires, who had wrestled with the meaning of freedom centuries before I was born. That contrast between the world of my studies and the world around me, a world of plantations, of bondage, of labor done by those who had no liberty at all, stirred something uneasy inside me. I did not speak of it then. I only read and thought and carried the tension quietly. At William and Mary, the world widened further. I was shy, reserved, reluctant to join the clamor of students who caroused and boasted. But my professors saw something in me. They guided me, sharpened me, gave me not only knowledge, but confidence. In the lecture halls and libraries, I discovered that my hunger for learning was not a weakness, but a strength, that my quiet nature concealed a mind eager to grasp the patterns of law, the architecture of government, the music of reason itself. I spent hours in solitude, reading until candlelight burned low, and in those hours I began to see that ideas were not abstractions but tools that could shape nations. I also discovered architecture, the art of building not merely for shelter but for beauty and harmony. Palladio became my guide, his principles of proportion and balance speaking to something deep in me. I dreamed of houses not yet built, of landscapes ordered by reason, of places where the physical world reflected the ideals of the mind. Those dreams would one day take form in Monticello, though at the time they were no more than sketches and imaginings in the margins of my notebooks. Yet even as my education elevated me, I remained bound to the soil of Virginia. I knew the rhythm of plantation life, the reliance on labor that was not my own, the presence of enslaved people who worked the land that bore my name. Their voices, their lives, their humanity pressed against the edges of my consciousness, though I seldom confronted it openly. The contradiction lived in me from the beginning, the belief in liberty as an absolute truth, and the reality of bondage at my doorstep. That contradiction would follow me all my life, a shadow that lengthened even as my ideals soared. In those early years, I saw myself not as a man destined for public life, but as a seeker of knowledge, a cultivator of land, a lover of music and architecture. I was tall, awkward in gait, reserved in manner, but within me stirred a restlessness that books alone could not satisfy. I wrote in journals, drafted thoughts on government, sketched designs for buildings, all while imagining a future I could not yet name. When I walked alone at dusk, the sky painted with fire as the sun sank behind the Blue Ridge, I felt a stirring that I could not ignore. It was as if the land itself whispered of change, of a destiny unfolding beyond my sight. I thought then that I might spend my life in study and design, in the quiet pursuit of knowledge. But already, history's hand was reaching for me. The world around me trembled with discontent, murmurs of resistance rising in taverns and assemblies. Liberty was becoming more than philosophy, it was becoming necessity, and the boy who once hid in books and music would soon find himself called upon to wield the pen as a weapon sharper than any sword. That was my beginning, quiet, reflective, shaped by loss and learning, haunted by contradictions, and stirred by ideas that promised a future none of us could yet imagine. And though I could not know it then, the words I would one day write would carry farther than the Blue Ridge Hills, farther than Virginia, farther even than the continent. They would echo into eternity. The college years shaped me in ways I had not expected, though the transformation was not loud or immediate. It came as slow as the turning of seasons, as gradual as the growth of the trees I often admired on long, solitary walks. At William and Mary, I discovered the richness of ideas that would guide me all my life, and I began to feel for the first time the stirrings of a calling beyond the confines of my own household and land. I arrived there quiet, awkward, and unsure of myself. My frame was tall and lean, my movements ungainly, and I did not possess the confidence of those young men who relished attention. I preferred to sit silently in lectures, to lose myself in the thick pages of my books. Yet my professors noticed something in me. Dr. William Small, in particular, saw not just a student, but a mind hungry for depth. He guided me toward philosophy, mathematics, and the sciences, expanding my world beyond the limits of Virginia's plantations. He became more than a teacher. He was a mentor who opened doors I had not known existed. Through him, I was introduced to George Wythe, one of the greatest legal minds in the colonies. In Wythe's office, I read law with a seriousness that few others could sustain. The study of law was not dry to me. It was alive with the spirit of justice, the mechanics of order, the principles by which men could live together. I copied statutes by hand, studied precedents, and thought endlessly about the nature of authority and the balance between liberty and restraint. Those hours hunched over parchment were not tedious. They were electric, for I felt in them the foundation of a life's work beginning to form. Yet even as I pored over the texts of law and philosophy, the rhythms of Virginia never left me. I returned often to Shadwell, my family's estate, walking the lands that would one day become Monticello. There I felt the contradiction of my life press against me again and again. The soil was worked by men and women who did not belong to themselves. Their presence was as constant as the fields and the sky. I admired Cicero's rhetoric on freedom, Locke's philosophy of natural rights, Montesquieu's theories of government. Yet outside my window, human beings lived as property. I could not ignore them, but I did not yet have the courage, or perhaps the will, to reconcile these truths. I buried the tension in silence, choosing the path of thought rather than action. At William and Mary, my mind leapt beyond Virginia, beyond even England, to the greater world of ideas. I discovered the works of Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, and John Locke, three names that seemed to me the holy trinity of reason. Bacon taught me the method of inquiry, Newton the majesty of order in the universe, Locke the principles of government rooted in the consent of the governed. These men were not mere writers. They were architects of truth, and their ideas resonated in me as surely as music did. I began to believe that knowledge was not just the adornment of life, but its very foundation. In those years, I became something of a polymath. I practiced the violin for hours, losing myself in the sound of strings vibrating against silence. Music was my refuge, the place where reason gave way to feeling. I studied architecture with equal passion, sketching buildings inspired by Palladio, whose designs seemed to me the very embodiment of harmony and order. I believed that the construction of buildings was no less important than the construction of governments. Both were expressions of proportion, balance, and the pursuit of beauty. But it was not all study. I joined in the debates of fellow students, though I spoke less often than I listened. I was no orator then. Words came to me better when written than when spoken aloud. My quiet nature set me apart, yet it also gave me time to observe. to think more deeply than those who rushed into argument. When I did speak, my words carried weight, for they were deliberate. I learned that silence could be a form of power, a way to shape conversations by listening before striking. I also found myself drawn into the society of Williamsburg, its taverns and halls alive with talk of politics, trade, and discontent with Britain. I listened as planters grumbled about taxes, as lawyers debated the rights of the colonies, as whispers of resistance grew louder. I was still young, still more scholar than statesman, but I could feel the ground shifting beneath us. The colonies were restless, and though I did not yet take up their cause openly, the ideas I absorbed prepared me for the day when I would. In those years, I came to understand that liberty was not just a theory, but a necessity. The writings of Locke on natural rights, the lessons of Montesquieu on the separation of powers, the examples of ancient republics, they were not abstractions. They were seeds planted in soil already fertile with discontent. I realized that government was not ordained by kings but built by men, and that if it was built unjustly, it could be torn down. This was not yet rebellion, but it was the first whisper of it in my heart. My friendships at William and Mary were few, but they mattered. I was drawn to men of intellect rather than charm, men who could converse about books and ideas rather than hunting or sport. We walked the streets at night, lanterns flickering, debating the meaning of freedom, the role of reason, the possibility of change. These were not idle talks, they were rehearsals for what would one day become revolution. It was also at this time that I began to think of Virginia not just as home, but as a place of potential. I dreamed of what it could be, a commonwealth guided by reason, shaped by laws, inspired by beauty. Monticello began to form in my mind not just as a house, but as a symbol of those dreams. I saw a hill where a house could rise, windows opening to the horizon, halls filled with books, gardens laid out with precision, a place where philosophy and life could meet. That vision stayed with me, carried like a flame through the years of turmoil to come. Still, the contradictions did not leave me. I read Rousseau's words on freedom and equality, yet dined in halls where servants stood silently at the wall. I studied the rights of man, yet inherited the rights of master. These truths coexisted uneasily in me, not reconciled but ignored, as if silence could erase them. In time, silence would no longer suffice, but in those years I chose the path of thought, not confrontation. By the time I completed my studies, I was not the awkward boy who had first arrived. I was a man shaped by philosophy, by law, by music, by architecture, by the grandeur of ideas that stretched beyond Virginia's hills. I had not yet found my voice in politics, but I had found the foundation upon which it would rest. I understood now that knowledge was not an end in itself, but a tool, and that it was my duty to use it. As I left William and Mary, I carried with me not just books and notes, but a sense of purpose I could not yet name. I knew only this: the world was changing, the colonies were stirring, and the ideas that had once lived quietly in the margins of my journals would soon be demanded of me in the open air of assemblies and congresses. The pen I held for study would one day write words that might alter the fate of nations. For now, though, I returned to Virginia, to the land and the people who had always been my anchor. I walked the fields again, the same fields I had known as a boy, but now I saw them differently. They were not just soil and crop, but the stage of history. And as I looked upon them, I knew that the quiet boy who had once listened to the hum of summer was no longer only a dreamer. He was a man preparing, though he did not yet know it, to shape the destiny of a people. And so my life's second chapter closed, not with triumph, not with battle, but with preparation. The world beyond my books had begun to call, and soon I would answer, and that it was my duty to use it. As I left William and Mary, I carried with me not just books and notes, but a sense of purpose I could not yet name. I knew only this: the world was changing, the colonies were stirring, and the ideas that had once lived quietly in the margins of my journals would soon be demanded of me in the open air of assemblies and congresses. The pen I held for study would one day write words that might alter the fate of nations. For now, though, I returned to Virginia, to the land and the people who had always been my anchor. I walked the fields again, the same fields I had known as a boy, but now I saw them differently. They were not just soil and crop, but the stage of history. And as I looked upon them, I knew that the quiet boy who had once listened to the hum of summer was no longer only a dreamer. He was a man preparing, though he did not yet know it, to shape the destiny of a people. And so my life's second chapter closed, not with triumph, not with battle, but with preparation. The world beyond my books had begun to call, and soon I would answer. The world around me was beginning to tremble with change, though few at first could sense its magnitude. The Virginia I returned to was still cloaked in the familiar rhythms of plantation life, the fields alive with labor, the great houses standing as symbols of stability, the assemblies filled with voices debating taxes and land. Yet beneath that familiar surface, murmurs grew louder, whispers turning into words that carried through taverns and courthouse steps. The colonies were restless, and the air itself seemed charged with something new. I had returned from my studies full of ideas, my head filled with Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau. Those names were not merely ink on paper. They were living companions, whispering that liberty was a birthright, that tyranny could be resisted, that men had the power to craft governments rather than inherit them. And as I sat once more in Virginia, I found that the world outside my books had begun to echo those very whispers. The Stamp Act had passed, Parliament had overreached, and colonists across the 13 states were questioning not only the fairness of taxes, but the very nature of their allegiance to Britain. I entered the House of Burgesses as a young man, quiet and reserved, yet burning with conviction. I listened more than I spoke, observed more than I argued. But each session confirmed what I already felt. The empire that had nurtured us now threatened to strangle us. Britain treated us not as partners, but as subjects, our voices dismissed, our needs ignored. For every tax levied, every law imposed without our consent, a seed of rebellion took root. I was not yet ready to call it by name, but I knew the soil was fertile. It was during this time that I wrote a summary view of the rights of British America. I drafted it not for the sake of fame, but out of necessity, out of a compulsion to give voice to what so many were feeling but struggling to articulate. I argued that the colonies were not dependencies of Parliament, but independent communities tied to the Crown only by mutual consent. It was bold, perhaps reckless, and it spread far beyond what I expected. Men who had never met me read those words and recognized their own thoughts in them. My pen, quiet and deliberate, had begun to shape public opinion. The reaction was swift. Some praised my clarity, others denounced me as dangerous, presumptuous, a radical. Yet I felt a strange calm through it all. I had not sought controversy, but once it found me, I did not shrink from it. For the first time, I sensed that my pen could carry more weight than many men's swords. That realization both frightened and emboldened me. As the years crept toward revolution, I found myself more deeply entangled in the currents of history. The Boston Tea Party, the intolerable acts, the first shots at Lexington and Concord, each event struck like a drumbeat, louder, faster, impossible to ignore. Virginia, too, stirred with urgency, sending delegates to gather in Congress, to speak of resistance, to whisper of independence. I was chosen among them, not because I was loud or fiery, but because I could write, and because I carried myself with a kind of seriousness that made men listen. The journey to Philadelphia was not merely a physical one, it was a passage into the heart of history. The city bustled with energy, its streets filled with merchants, soldiers, and citizens who spoke openly now of breaking free. I felt the gravity of it settle upon me as I entered the halls where delegates met. There I encountered men whose names would one day live alongside mine. John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, men of wit and fire, men unafraid to speak boldly. Compared to them, I seemed almost invisible at first, my voice soft, my presence subdued. Yet when I wrote, when I placed pen to paper, even they leaned in to read. The debates were fierce, the risks unthinkable. To declare independence was to invite death, to sign our names to treason, and yet the tide carried us forward. I remember one evening, walking alone through the streets of Philadelphia, lantern light flickering against the brick, the air filled with tension. I asked myself quietly, could we truly break from Britain? Could words written on parchment hold the power to sever centuries of rule? And yet, even as I asked, I knew the answer. It was no longer a matter of choice. The people demanded it. History demanded it. My reputation as a writer, quiet but precise, led to my selection for the committee tasked with drafting the Declaration. John Adams, ever forceful, insisted I take the lead. "You can write 10 times better than I can," he told me. And though I demurred, though I doubted, I accepted. That acceptance changed everything. The task was monumental. To distill the spirit of a people into words that could carry across the world, to declare not only our separation but our very existence as a nation. I sat alone with my thoughts, quill in hand, the weight of history pressing upon me. I wrote not for myself but for millions, for generations unborn, for ideals greater than any one man. The words flowed, shaped by every book I had read, every contradiction I had wrestled with, every dream I carried of a republic guided by reason and liberty. All men are created equal. The phrase struck me with the clarity of truth, though even then I knew it carried shadows I could not dispel. Still, it was the heart of what we sought, the principle that bound us. The draft complete, I submitted it, only to see it debated, edited, altered. Passages condemning slavery were struck out, compromises made to preserve unity among the colonies. I felt the sting of those omissions, the silence forced upon truths I longed to proclaim. Yet I accepted it, knowing that a flawed declaration was better than none, that history would judge us harshly if we faltered now. As the Congress moved closer to its decision, the tension thickened. Men whispered of gallows, of British retribution, of the cost of treason. I carried those fears as heavily as any, but I also carried certainty. The time for hesitation was gone. When the day came to vote, I felt a calm unlike any before. The decision was made. The colonies would be free. But that moment was yet to arrive fully. At this point in my story, I was still the quiet Virginian, newly emerged onto the stage of revolution, my name not yet revealed, my identity hidden beneath the growing roar of history. I was simply a man with a pen, shaping words that would soon ignite a nation. And though I could not yet see the full measure of what those words would bring, I sensed, deep within, that the course of my life had shifted forever. The boy who had once walked in silence among Virginia E.S. fields was now at the threshold of a storm that would consume the world. And the next words I would write would echo farther than I could ever imagine. The hall in Philadelphia was stifling, the air thick with the heat of summer and the weight of destiny. The delegates gathered in their coats and wigs, faces shining with sweat, their voices raised in argument that sometimes swelled into anger, sometimes fell into exhausted silence. Outside, the city bustled with the tension of war already begun, militia marching, bells tolling, whispers of British retaliation carried from tavern to tavern. Inside, we spoke not of compromise but of freedom, a word that burned like fire on the tongue. It was in that hall, in those weeks of debate, that my name would finally become bound to history. I had been chosen to draft the Declaration not for my voice, for I was not known for eloquence in speech, but for the precision of my pen. John Adams and Benjamin Franklin sat with me on the committee, their experience and wit steadying the task. Yet it was Adams who pressed the responsibility upon me. He believed my words carried a clarity his speeches could not. I resisted at first, unsure, but he insisted. And so I took up the burden in a small rented room, quill in hand, parchment spread before me, the weight of a continent pressing on my shoulders. Those days were a blur of ink and thought, my mind reaching back through every book I had studied, every idea I had wrestled with. Locke's natural rights, Montesquieu's balance of power, the lessons of Cicero and Rousseau. They all came to me now, not as abstract theories, but as living truths that demanded voice. I wrote with urgency, as if time itself would falter if I delayed. The words poured out. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Even as I wrote, I felt the contradiction stir within me. I wrote of equality, while enslaved men and women moved silently through my household in Virginia, their labor making possible the very leisure in which I studied and wrote. I told myself the Declaration was for the nation, not my private conscience, yet the tension gnawed at me. I placed it aside, as I often did, for the sake of the greater task. History demanded clarity, and so I gave it clarity, even if it demanded silence in other places. When I presented the draft to the committee, Franklin smiled gently. Adams nodded firmly, but both suggested edits. They trimmed words, adjusted phrases, balanced my precision with their pragmatism. When it reached Congress, the debates grew harsher. Passages condemning slavery and the slave trade were struck out, Southern delegates unwilling to bear them, Northern merchants complicit in their silence. I watched as those lines vanished from the parchment, each strike a wound to the ideals I had poured forth. Yet I accepted it, knowing that unity was more vital than perfection. We could not falter. We could not fail. The days that followed were a trial of nerves. Delegates argued late into the night, their tempers fraying under heat and fear. Some hesitated still, whispering that Britain's wrath would fall swift and merciless. Others declared boldly that independence was already reality, that this declaration only gave voice to what existed in fact. Through it all I remained quiet, my words having already been written. My part was done, and now I could only watch as others shaped its fate. At last, the moment came. On July the 2nd, the Congress voted for independence. On July 4th, they adopted the Declaration itself, my words now the words of a nation. The document was read aloud, its phrases carrying across the room and soon into the streets, where crowds gathered to hear what we had dared to proclaim. Bells rang, guns fired in salute, and the city erupted in celebration. For a moment the fear lifted, replaced by hope, by the thrill of freedom declared. As I stood in that hall, listening to my words carried by another's voice, I felt a stillness settle over me. I was not triumphant, nor exultant. I was calm, reflective, aware that we had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return. Britain would brand us traitors, war would deepen, blood would spill, lives would be lost. But the die was cast. The colonies were no longer colonies. They were a people, a nation, bound by words that had come from my hand. When the delegates signed their names, each stroke of the quill was a sentence of treason should we fail. I signed mine with steady hand, though I knew the gallows could be my end. Yet I felt no regret. For all my contradictions, all my silences, I believed in the truth we had declared. Liberty was worth the risk, worth the cost. And if the words endured, perhaps one day they would grow beyond even the limitations we had placed upon them. That day in Philadelphia revealed my name to history. No longer the quiet Virginian in the background, I was Thomas Jefferson, the man who had drafted the Declaration of Independence. The identity could not be undone. The responsibility could not be escaped. My words now belonged not to me but to the world, and they would live long after my hand had stilled. Yet even in that moment of glory, I sensed the shadows ahead. Declaring independence was one thing, winning it was another, and building a nation true to those words would prove harder still. But for that one day, the world had shifted. A new country had been born, its birth cry written in ink, and I had been its midwife. The bell tolled in the steeple, the streets roared with joy, and I stood in silence, my thoughts as heavy as they were hopeful. The story was only beginning, and I knew already it would test me in ways that words alone could never prepare me for. The war raged on, loud and unrelenting, but my life drew me back to Virginia, to Monticello, where shadows stretched long across the land. While others fought with muskets and cannons, my role turned inward, to the labor of governance, to the struggle of shaping laws, and to the restless work of balancing ideals against reality. It was at Monticello that the contradictions of my life became most visible, for the house I built, the vision I nurtured, stood upon foundations I could never fully reconcile. Monticello was more than a home. It was my experiment in architecture, philosophy, and harmony. Perched atop its hill, it looked down across fields and valleys, a reflection of order imposed upon the wilderness. I poured myself into its design, blending Palladio's principles with my own vision of symmetry, balance, and beauty. I wanted Monticello to be a world unto itself, gardens filled with plants from across the earth, halls lined with books and instruments, walls hung with art that carried the weight of centuries. In its rooms, I sought to unite knowledge and life, to create a place where thought could breathe. And yet, Monticello was also a plantation, worked by enslaved men, women, and children whose labor sustained the dream I built. Their hands laid the bricks, tended the crops, served the meals, while I wrote of liberty, of equality, of rights endowed by nature. The contradiction grew sharper each year, a wound I could not close, and yet I did not sever myself from it. I wrote of freedom in one hand while I signed records of bondage with the other. History would not let me forget this silence, and even then I knew it. But I chose silence still, convincing myself that one day the contradiction might resolve itself in the tide of history. Rumors swirled even in my lifetime, whispers of my relationship with Sally Hemings, an enslaved woman of Monticello. She was bound to me not only by circumstance but by blood, a half-sister to my late wife, Martha. The whispers carried from the plantation to the public, staining my reputation with accusation and speculation. I did not answer them, neither in denial nor in confession. I kept my silence, letting the world make of it what it would. Yet within me I felt the weight of that truth, the shadow it cast upon my ideals. I spoke of liberty as a universal right, yet in my own home, lives were bound to chains they could not escape. After Martha's death, my grief was deep and consuming. She had been my companion, the love of my life, the anchor of my household. When she died, I fell into silence so heavy that even my closest friends feared for me. I promised her on her deathbed I would never remarry, and I kept that vow. Yet her absence left me hollow, and Monticello became both a sanctuary and a prison, filled with memory and shadow. I walked its halls alone, my pen my only companion, pouring my grief into words and my solace into books. The turn of the century carried with it a storm of politics unlike any I had seen before. The republic we had created was fragile, pulled by competing visions. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton and the Federalists, who believed in a strong central government, in commerce and finance as the backbone of the nation. On the other side stood myself, and those who thought as I did, James Madison, Albert Gallatin, men who believed in the strength of the states, in agriculture as the purest foundation of liberty, in simplicity as the safeguard of the republic. These were not academic debates. They were struggles for the very soul of America. I entered the fray reluctantly. I had no hunger for power, no taste for the raw ambition that drove others. Yet I could not stand aside while the vision I held for the nation was threatened. I founded with Madison the Democratic-Republican Party, not in name but in spirit, a coalition of farmers, laborers, and thinkers who believed liberty must be guarded against encroachment. Our rivalry with Hamilton's Federalists grew fierce, words as sharp as swords, newspapers filled with venom, accusations flying. The air itself felt poisoned, and politics became war by other means. In 1796, I stood for the presidency for the first time and lost to John Adams. I became his vice president, a role awkward and bitter, for our visions were at odds. Adams, proud and blunt, pursued policies I opposed, particularly the Alien and Sedition Acts, which sought to silence dissent. I wrote in secret the Kentucky Resolutions, denouncing those laws as unconstitutional. asserting that states could resist tyranny. The act was bold, dangerous even, but I could not remain silent while liberty was threatened. It was a taste of what was to come, a foreshadowing of the conflict that would define my career. Then came the election of 1800, the most divisive contest the young republic had yet endured. Federalists painted me as a radical, a godless Jacobin who would import the violence of France to American soil. They warned that my presidency would bring ruin, that churches would burn, that morality itself would collapse. I bore the attacks in silence, but the accusations spread like wildfire. Still, the people's will was clear. The vote was cast, and when the dust settled, the tally revealed a tie between myself and Aaron Burr, my running mate. The decision went to the House of Representatives, where chaos reigned. Ballot after ballot, stalemate after stalemate, the fate of the Republic hung in balance. For days, uncertainty gripped the nation. Would we survive a crisis so soon after our birth? Would ambition tear us apart before we had even taken root? At last, through backroom maneuvering and Hamilton's own hand turned against Burr, the stalemate broke. I was elected the third president of the United States. The so-called Revolution of 1800 was not won with blood, but with ballots, the first peaceful transfer of power between rival parties in our history. That alone, I knew, was a victory greater than any speech. On the day of my inauguration, I walked to the Capitol rather than ride in a carriage, a simple act to symbolize the humility I believed the office should bear. I dressed plainly, without flourish, without pomp. I wished to show that government was not the domain of aristocracy, but of the people. My words that day were measured, seeking unity. We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists. I believed it then, or perhaps I hoped it, though I knew divisions would not vanish with a phrase. The challenges before me were immense. The Republic was young, its institutions untested, its enemies abroad watching eagerly for weakness. Yet I carried into office the same quiet determination that had guided me all my life. I reduced the size of government, cut taxes, dismantled armies I believed too large for a peaceful nation. I believed in frugality, in simplicity, in a government that interfered little with the daily lives of its citizens. The office did not change me. I sought instead to change the office, to strip it of royal airs, to make it a servant rather than a master. But even as I spoke of simplicity, I reached for greatness. Opportunity came in 1803, when Napoleon, pressed by war and defeat in Haiti, offered to sell us the Louisiana Territory. The purchase would double the size of the United States, securing the Mississippi, opening vast lands to farmers, fulfilling my dream of an empire of liberty. And yet it was not so simple. Nowhere in the Constitution was such a purchase authorized. I had long argued for strict adherence to that document, yet here I stood, tempted to stretch it. I hesitated, torn between principle and opportunity. But in the end, I chose the nation's future over my scruples. For $15 million, we acquired land stretching to the Rockies, and with it, destiny itself. The Louisiana Purchase was my proudest achievement, and yet even it carried shadows. Native peoples who had lived on that land for centuries would now face displacement, their cultures pressed by the tide of expansion. Slavery, too, would spread westward, the contradiction of liberty and bondage deepening. Even as I celebrated, I felt the unease settle. Progress always carried costs, and I could not pretend otherwise. To explore the new territory, I commissioned Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, sending them on a journey into the unknown. Their expedition, filled with hardship and discovery, became a symbol of our young nation's courage and ambition. Reports of rivers, mountains, and fertile land stirred the imagination of every American, expanding not only our borders, but our sense of possibility. My presidency was not without storms. Pirates in the Mediterranean demanded tribute, and when we resisted, conflict ensued. The Barbary Wars tested our navy, our resolve, and our honor. At home, partisan attacks continued, Federalists unrelenting in their accusations. And abroad, the shadow of Europe's wars loomed, threatening to drag us into conflicts not our own. Yet through it all I held to my vision, a republic of farmers, simple in its government, broad in its liberty, secure in its independence. I knew the task was fragile, that mistakes would be made, that critics would howl. But I also knew that history would measure not each stumble, but the course as a whole. In those years I walked often through the halls of the White House, still new, its walls bare, its chambers sparse. I filled it not with luxury, but with books, maps, and the quiet presence of knowledge. I believed that the seat of power should not dazzle but inspire, not command awe but invite thought. Each decision I made, each risk I took, was guided by the same truth. The Republic was young, and it was my duty to nurture it carefully. From Virginia's quiet hills to the highest office in the land, my journey had been improbable. Yet I carried with me always the same tools: silence, reflection, persistence, and the belief that ideas could shape nations. The presidency had elevated me, but it had also tested me, forcing choices between principle and power, between ideals and reality. And though critics called me inconsistent, though even I felt the sting of compromise, I knew the path was necessary. For in those years, America did not falter. It grew, it expanded, it endured. And that, above all, was the measure of my time in power. The pen that had once declared independence now guided a nation into its future. And though the weight of contradiction never left me, I bore it, for the Republic demanded nothing less. The second term weighed heavier than the first, for the hopes that once burned bright now flickered under the strain of disappointment. When I had entered office, I carried with me the vision of an empire of liberty, a republic secure in its independence, modest in its government, vast in its opportunity. By the time I faced the final years of my presidency, I felt those ideals tested on every side, by enemies abroad, by partisans at home, and by the burden of decisions that offered no path without cost. The shadow of Europe's wars reached across the Atlantic, disturbing our peace. Britain and France, locked once again in bitter conflict, saw America not as a neutral nation but as prey. Our ships carrying grain and goods were seized, our sailors impressed into foreign service, our trade strangled by arrogance and power. I sought peace, I pleaded for reason, but reason was a weak shield against empire. The cries grew louder. Britain disrespected us, France mocked us, and our people demanded protection. Yet war, I knew, would tear apart the fragile fabric of the Republic. I turned instead to measures that might preserve peace without battle. The Embargo Act of 1807 was my answer, a desperate attempt to wield commerce as a weapon, to punish Britain and France by denying them our trade. I believed it would be a temporary pain, that the world's powers would bend to the loss of American goods. But the reality was harsher. The embargo crippled our own merchants, left ships rotting in harbors, drove farmers and workers to despair. Smuggling thrived, resentment flared, and the very people I had sworn to protect cursed my name. I had sought to shield America from war, but instead I had delivered hardship. Each complaint that reached me, each petition that crossed my desk was a reminder of my miscalculation. Even my supporters wavered, their faith shaken. The Federalists, never missing a chance to strike, painted me as tyrannical, claiming I had betrayed the very liberty I once proclaimed. Their newspapers dripped with venom, accusing me of hypocrisy, weakness, failure. I bore the attacks in silence, as was my habit, but within me the sting cut deep. For years I had been called inconsistent, an advocate of small government who presided over the greatest land purchase in history, a champion of liberty who lived among slaves. The embargo confirmed for many what they already believed, that I was a man of contradiction, a philosopher unfit for the harsh realities of governance. Yet even amid failure, there were achievements that gave me solace. The Lewis and Clark expedition returned, their journals filled with maps, discoveries, and wonders that stretched the imagination. The vast lands of Louisiana were no longer an empty purchase, but a world of rivers, mountains, and peoples revealed. Their success, their endurance was a testament to the spirit of exploration I believed would define America. I read their reports with pride, even as storms gathered elsewhere. At home, I sought to nurture knowledge and reason. I laid plans for the University of Virginia, believing education to be the surest safeguard of liberty. I dreamed of a place where young minds could be trained not in dogma, but in inquiry, where truth could be pursued freely, where knowledge itself would become the cornerstone of the Republic. It was a vision for the future, perhaps beyond my own time, but one I believed essential. Still, the burdens of office grew heavier. Each decision seemed to erode the unity I had once sought. The words of my first inauguration, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists," now felt hollow, mocked by the venom of partisanship. I watched as Congress fractured, as newspapers fanned the flames of division, as ambition tore at the heart of government. I had hoped to be a healer, to bridge the gap between factions. Instead, I presided over a nation more divided than ever. By the time my second term drew to its end, I felt not triumph, but weariness. I longed for Monticello, for the quiet of my hill, for the company of books and gardens. I knew I had given what I could, that my time in office had been marked by both greatness and error. The Louisiana Purchase, the exploration of the West, the defense of liberty at home, these were victories I cherished. The embargo, the divisions, the disappointments, these were failures I could not escape. When I left Washington in 1809, I did so with relief. The presidency had aged me, tested me, revealed the limits of my strength. I rode back to Virginia quietly, without fanfare, eager to shed the trappings of power. Yet I knew, as I gazed once more upon Monticello's familiar hill, that my story was not finished. Retirement would not bring silence. The world still called, and though I longed for peace, the nation's demands would find me again. I carried back with me the contradictions that had defined my life. I was a man who proclaimed liberty while holding men in bondage, who preached simplicity while shaping vast expansion, who sought peace and delivered hardship. History would not absolve me of these truths, but I hoped it would also remember the ideals I had carried, the words I had written, the vision I had pursued even when flawed. As I stepped into retirement, I told myself I would dedicate my remaining years not to power, but to reflection, to knowledge, to building something lasting beyond the noise of politics. The presidency had tested me. Now Monticello would sustain me, and in its halls I would seek a quieter legacy, one built not on laws or wars, but on ideas that might outlast them all. Monticello welcomed me home like an old friend, its hill rising steady above the valleys I had known since boyhood. After 8 years of the presidency, scarred by conflict and compromise, I longed for the quiet of its rooms, the company of my books, the solace of my gardens. I told myself I was done with politics, that I would retreat into the life of a private man, content to spend my days among family, architecture, and study. Yet the truth is that a man who has tasted the weight of history can never fully escape it. Even in retirement, the world found me, drew me into its demands, and tested me still. Monticello was my sanctuary, but it was also my experiment, the embodiment of my ideals. I walked its halls daily, arranging artifacts from travels and gifts from friends, surrounding myself with reminders of the world's vastness. Maps lined my walls, telescopes peered at the heavens, instruments filled the rooms with music when hands touched their strings. I believed that a house could reflect a mind, and Monticello reflected mine, restless, curious, contradictory. I experimented with crops, planting new varieties, testing what the soil could yield. I watched the seasons turn, finding in their rhythm a peace politics had denied me. Yet the shadow of slavery remained. Every brick of Monticello, every harvest from its fields, depended on the lives of those I held in bondage. I knew it, I felt it. I wrote against the institution in words, yet in practice I did nothing to sever myself from it. Visitors noticed the contradiction. History would not forget it. In my quiet hours, I pondered liberty as philosophy, even as the voices of those enslaved echoed through my home. That contradiction was the deepest wound of my life, and though I carried it silently, it never left me. Even as I sought retreat, I could not resist the urge to shape the future. Education became my obsession. I dreamed of a university free from dogma, a place where reason would reign, where students would be trained in science, philosophy, law, and the arts. The University of Virginia became my last great project, my final gift to the nation. I designed its buildings, oversaw its grounds, imagined its curriculum. I wanted it to be not merely a school, but a temple of knowledge, a testament to the belief that liberty could only endure if minds were enlightened. I spent years on its construction, often walking the grounds, discussing plans with masons, imagining generations of youth walking its lawns long after I was gone. Meanwhile, my correspondence flourished. Letters became my true stage in retirement. I wrote to Madison, to Adams, to countless others, exchanging thoughts on philosophy, government, and the lessons of our time. My letters to John Adams were especially rich. Our rivalry transformed into friendship. Our debates softened by age into reflections of two old men who had shaped a nation. We spoke of revolution, of governance, of mortality, our words weaving together a tapestry of wisdom for those who would follow. But retirement was not free from hardship. My finances, mismanaged and strained, weighed heavily upon me. The costs of Monticello, of hospitality, of my generosity, left me drowning in debt. Visitors came constantly, scholars, politicians, travelers from abroad, and I welcomed them all, believing it my duty to open my home as a beacon of the Republic. Yet every guest meant another expense, and my wealth dwindled until even Monticello itself stood as a monument I could barely afford to maintain. Pride prevented me from admitting it fully, but the truth was plain. I had built a dream larger than my means, and I would leave my heirs burdened with its cost. Still, I found solace in the knowledge that I had helped shape a nation that endured. I watched as new generations took the stage, as the Republic faced its trials, as the seeds we had planted grew into institutions. I saw flaws, divisions, betrayals of principle, but I also saw resilience. The Union did not collapse, even when storms threatened. That endurance gave me comfort, though I feared always that the contradiction of slavery would one day tear it apart. As I aged, my body weakened, but my mind remained restless. I read endlessly, studied languages, explored science. I believed that curiosity was the truest form of life, that to stop learning was to die before death. In my final years, I often sat at my writing desk, sunlight streaming through Monticello's windows, the sounds of labor drifting in from the fields, and I felt both pride and sorrow. Pride in what I had written, what I had built, what I had dreamed. Sorrow in what I had failed to resolve, the burdens I left for others to carry. When the 50th anniversary of the Declaration approached, I was asked to write one last letter. My hand trembled, my health failing, but I wrote still, my words carrying the same hope I had felt in that hall in Philadelphia. I spoke of liberty not as something completed, but as something ever pursued, an ideal that must be renewed in every generation. I knew then that my time was short, that the words I wrote would be among my last. Monticello stood serene that summer, the sky clear, the fields green. I looked out upon it one final time, knowing that my life had been one long attempt to reconcile vision and reality, ideals and contradictions, liberty and bondage. I had not succeeded fully, perhaps no man could, but I had tried, and in that effort I had left a mark upon the world. The boy who once walked the fields in silence had carried a pen that shaped a nation. The man who built Monticello had lived a life of brilliance and contradiction. And as I prepared to leave it behind, I could only hope that history would remember not only my failures, but also my faith in liberty and knowledge, in the possibility of a people governing themselves. For that faith was the heart of my life, and it was all I had to give. The summer of 1826 settled gently over Virginia, but I felt its weight, as though each day carried the hush of farewell. My body had grown frail, my steps uncertain, yet my mind still wandered to the past and reached toward the future. The 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence approached, and with it came a flood of memory. Half a century had passed since I first put quill to parchment and wrote the words that declared us free. I had been young then, unscarred by office, filled with ideals that burned bright and pure. Now, as age bent me, I saw those words not as the triumph of a single moment, but as a promise unfinished, still waiting to be fulfilled. I was asked to write a letter for the celebration in Washington, and though illness gnawed at me, I answered. My hand trembled, but the words flowed still. I wrote that the principles of liberty, once declared, could never die, that they belonged not only to America, but to the world, that each generation must claim them anew. I felt as if I was speaking not only to my countrymen, but to time itself, sending forth one last reminder that freedom is fragile and eternal, demanding vigilance and sacrifice. It was my final gift, my last service to the nation I had helped bring into being. Monticello was alive with visitors in those last days. Friends, admirers, and strangers came to see me, to sit in my presence, to speak of the Republic's endurance. I welcomed them with the quiet dignity I had always carried, though my strength waned. Each conversation left me weary, yet I felt it my duty still to receive them, for I was not merely Thomas Jefferson the man, but Thomas Jefferson the symbol, and I could not turn them away. My debts remained heavy, my affairs tangled, but I no longer fretted over them. My concern now was only for the nation, for the memory of liberty, for the endurance of knowledge. On July 3rd, as night fell, I felt the end drawing near. The house was quiet save for the sounds of those who tended me. I drifted in and out of consciousness, my thoughts circling back to the halls of Philadelphia, to the ringing of the bell, to the faces of Adams, Franklin, and the men who had signed alongside me. We had risked everything, and against all odds, the nation had survived. That survival was my comfort as the darkness deepened. The morning of July 4th dawned bright over Monticello. I stirred only faintly, my breath shallow, my body weakened beyond recovery. I asked once if it was the 4th. They told me it was. A faint smile touched me then, for I knew that my life would end on the day of its greatest beginning. Fate had given me this gift, to close my eyes 50 years to the day after declaring a people free. As I slipped away, I thought of liberty not as perfection but as pursuit, not as an achievement but as a journey. I thought of Monticello, the house that bore my contradictions, the sanctuary of my mind. I thought of the University of Virginia, rising as my last monument, a temple of knowledge that I prayed would outlive my faults. I thought of my children, of Martha, of the loves and sorrows that had shaped me. And above all, I thought of the words I had written, the words that would endure beyond me. All men are created equal. On that same day, across the miles in Massachusetts, John Adams breathed his last as well. His final words said to have been, "Thomas Jefferson still survives." In truth, I had gone hours before him, but perhaps in spirit he was right, for in those words, in that declaration, in that fragile but enduring republic, I do still survive. I was not a perfect man. I was full of contradictions, my ideals higher than my actions, my silence louder than my confessions. Yet I gave what I could, a vision of liberty, a belief in knowledge, a faith in the capacity of people to govern themselves. That vision was flawed, but it endures, growing beyond me, shaping generations I will never know. And so my life ended where it began, in the hills of Virginia, quiet, reflective, bound to the land and to the ideas that had defined me. I left behind not riches, not purity, but words. Words that declared a nation, words that promised freedom, words that, though born of contradiction, carried truth strong enough to outlast me. When you speak my name, do not see me as a man free of error. See me instead as a man who reached for ideals larger than himself, who gave voice to liberty even while wrestling with its meaning. For in that striving, in that tension, lies the true story of Thomas Jefferson. Not perfect, not whole, but enduring, as long as freedom itself endures.